The last thing I want to show is some manipulations we can do to vectors of procedurals and really add a lot more randomness to the shapes. One thing you'll notice about this specific setup, and I'm using my version 6 file of the city function, um, looking at it from above, we have a lot of these buildings that are identical in size, and their subtractive areas are also about the same, because we don't really have any sort of randomness to their overall shape. There are a lot of ways to manipulate this, but I specifically want to take a look and really show what you can do with manipulating a vector and the information before it even reaches the noise, because that can have some really cool effects. One thing I want to do is increase the scale of the function within the editor. I'm also, when I go into edit the function, I am going to make a couple of changes to pull out some different details. Going over to the combiner of the detail side, the final combiner, I am going to switch the mode to minimum and get some of those smaller details coming out, because those weren't really showing all that well throughout the other scenes. Also go to the combiner that combines the detail with the original function and set that to minimum as well. And then we can adjust the offset and amplitude to really get something that's going to work a little better. And I think actually maybe I will leave this one on add, depending on how it turns out. Actually, I think this one I will leave on add, and just taking care of the detail of the other combiner, having that set to minimum, pulls out a lot of these details. So before I make any additional changes, I would like to show and just do a quick render so we can see the current function. And we still don't have a lot of real fine details. I would definitely suggest, if you're creating this on your own end, to add more noises that are smaller to add on top to really increase the detail amount. I'm going to go to the material, take the contrast and bring it down to 7. Highlights, increase the highlights just a little, decrease the global size. And I also want to decrease ambient to 30 and change the color of the color map a little bit darker, a little more desaturated, just so that we can see it a little bit better. Also, I'm going to add a layer and just cancel that and do kind of a darker gray. And then set that in the environment to be at a low altitude. So negative 0.85. We'll see how well that shows up. Just go ahead and render that out. Don't really like that color, but either way, we can still see the current detail. I'm also going to just take that top fuzziness of that top layer and increase that to about 15. That way there's a nice transition. So for the most part, we see some pretty even zones. The block effect is pretty much equal throughout. We don't really have any major scale variations. It's all kind of the same. So let's go ahead and modify the function. And I'm also just going to modify the sunlight just a little in the atmosphere editor. Going into the function, There are a lot of vector manipulations we could do. Um, every single node and every noise that we have in here has the ability to extract its origin. Well, these origins can be manipulated with turbulence nodes. And a turbulence is a vector-based noise that will manipulate the vector. So if we wanted to individually manipulate any of these, we can pull out the origin and to connect that. But what I want to show right now is, if you remember, we created that meta node, the vector transform, and this is before I extracted anything and published. What I'm going to do is just ungroup it to get access to everything that's in it. But since everything was nice and cleanly created, we can modify the vector of everything. And there's more than one way we can do this. We can connect this to a turbulence, and the turbulence node is just above the combiner on the left. What you can do is you can use a simple turbulence or advanced, and the view 4 style. Advanced and view 4 have a noise option where we can choose which noise we'd like to use, but it does limit us a little bit because we can't manipulate it like we would a numeric function. So there's a cool thing I like to do, which is adding in a math node vector operation composer, and then creating a noise. And now this is duplicating one of the ones from earlier. I'm going to switch this over to cube. It's the square samples 2D. I'm going to switch this to the square samples. We'll do 0 to 1 cell to begin with, and get rid of the randomness for now. Turn on random altitudes. Decrease our scale to around 0.4. Get rid of any origin change. And I'm also going to set my size to 1 all the way across. Just to start with, shape I'm going to set to cube. And now I'm going to connect every single portion. Or actually, I know that I'm going to run into a problem a little later with the Z being connected because of the way it's going to modify some of the origins of the different noises in here. So what I'm going to do instead is just connect the X and Y of the composer, and if you're using view 7 or earlier, then these will be input 0 and input 1, which represent X and Y. So now we can connect this offset to the composer. So we're basically creating our own turbulence node. So instead of using the view turbulence, we've created our own. And this is, of course, still passing through the position up at the top. But you can already see a change where every single node is being offset by this. And it's helpful to do it this way by changing everything, because the blends between the different nodes and the different noises can turn out pretty cool. So what we could do is, if you decrease the scale to a very large or very small amount, you can see how everything is being manipulated and the scale of the manipulation. And it is based on just this noise. If you want to increase the effect, because right now we don't have the kind of controls that we do have within the turbulence, because we don't have the ability to manipulate the amplitude, roughness, and the roughness setting is because this is really more of a fractal than just a noise. We could also use a fractal node to get more detail if needed. If I switch this over to a fractal, you can see it pulls out a ton of detail. And remembering that fractals need to be scaled larger than noises to return the same result, although this one was done automatically. And to get it closer to being a noise once again, you can just get rid of the roughness, and that makes it basically a noise. So if you start to increase the roughness, it'll start bringing in even finer details. So that's another thing you could do while you're building the rest of the nodes. We used noise nodes for everything. You could easily switch these to a fractal just by selecting the fractal, and to keep the identical look, just remove the roughness. But then if you want to start bringing in finer details, you can start increasing roughness. So what I want to do with this fractal is now if we want to edit the noise settings, we need to click the edit button. I want to add a little randomness. It's creating some nice overlaps. We could also increase how many samples to manipulate from. A lot of different ways to control this. Also throwing in angular variations will start to skew buildings in different areas. That is something you would want to use with a sample of 0 to 1 or just 1 with a smaller size and some scale variation, definitely. That way only a few areas are angled. It is going to cause some problems. So I'm going to get rid of the angular variations just because I know that's really going to be a bit much. Let's do 0 to 2 for our samples. But as I was saying before, we don't have an amplitude control, anything like that. So if you need, you can modify now the individual X and Y numerically with the filter. So let's say we want to increase the output. Let's go ahead and create a multiply. And we could connect this, and let's just do one direction. So now we can increase the amplitude of just the x-axis. And that creates a pretty nice distribution. So you could do that for the other, for the y, and set one up, or you could have a dual control if we were to extract this and just connect them to the same number. Also keep in mind that now that we have a fractal, we can also increase the gain, which will increase the total amplitude of the vector manipulation. So we now have a lot more detail and variation throughout the entire function. So let's go ahead and take a look at this within the scene. Reduce the height because it is a bit much. And then we're going to also take a look at manipulating the levels of everything, because right now it's just one big flat terrain. And if we do want some height variations, there are some easy ways we could do that. That's technically not a vector technique, but I'll still show it to you because it is kind of important. So we can see just a whole bunch more variation in size, lots of little areas being extruded without having to go in and add additional noises, although we still have some very large flat areas showing. Those could also be beneficial. That is caused or was created by certain combination modes, so those can also be removed by modifying the combiners. But overall, just the amount of detail being pulled out of this is far greater than it was before. So what we can also do is manipulate the level and have some areas that drop down a lot further than the others, instead of this all relying on one flat surface. So obviously we could also add this to any sort of procedural terrain if we wanted to do that. Even with using the max or the minimum mode, you can mix those together with any sort of regular terrain. But I want to create more of a block type effect, and one of the easiest ways to do that is just blending it together. And we're going to create a blender combiner type node and create and let's go ahead and use a fractal again. Square patterns, actually distributed patterns, square samples 2D. Get rid of the roughness. Go to edit, remove the randomness for the moment, change our shape to cube. Size we'll set to 0.6. Random altitudes, let's do 0 to 1 sample per cell. And just start with that for now and connect the blender or the combiner to that fractal. And select the altitude. And now what we can do is multiply. And we can see that the scale is huge for that fractal. So we're going to reduce the scale to give us something a little more manageable, that will look better throughout. And if you need to, or you want to, you can switch over to different blending modes. But we can start to see certain areas dropping down. If we do 1 to 2 samples per cell, we should be able to get more variation. 3 to 4 should show a bit more. And we just want something that's going to work pretty well. We still have sort of a grid being shown, so that we can increase randomness, scale variation, change the shape over to cube, and let's do 0 to 1 samples per cell. See how that turns out. So now if we don't want to just multiply everything, because when you multiply it, it also will increase and decrease everything, so sometimes you still end up with sort of a medium look to it. Before I do anything else, I do want to just open this up in the scene. We do see more level variation. So it is already looking better. And then we can manipulate that noise with either a turbulence node or changing the vector the same way we manipulated the overall vector. So it definitely looks, or has way more dimension to it, so it looks better. We can continue using that same manipulator for the blender to increase the effect more. We can increase the gain in order to change the output, and this will create a much more defined levels that we can use to manipulate this. We can also switch over to a different mode. So if we want to add to the existing setup, it's basically raising up and creating very, very tall buildings. So it's really going to be dependent on the output you want. Minimum mode looks alright. We could subtract. That'll give a pretty nice look to it if we reduce the height, because right now that's a little tall. So this one still gave us kind of an even look to it overall. did lift up some of the sections. So I think the multiply is going to work best. Because we are using a fractal instead of a noise, it does work a lot better. And then if we wanted to start bringing in some roughness, we could also manipulate this further. If you want to smooth out the areas and have them drop off differently, so more of a rounded drop off, you can change the shape. That looks pretty interesting right there. So we could add another noise to expand on this even further and keep kind of stepping it up, and then also manipulate vectors with it and get some pretty nice depth out of these functions. But now we have something that's going to step up a little bit better. And I think that ends up looking way better than it did before, because it was just really flat and didn't have a lot of depth to it. And that's because of a lot of the mixing modes I used were mostly minimum or maximum mixing modes. I didn't use a lot of multipliers. So now with having a multiplier in here, right at the end, we can really get some great detail. So I'm just going to modify the camera a little, get a bit of a render going before we look at just one last technique I want to show. And obviously, because there's so much detail, it looks really bad in some areas with the ambient light and where the fall off is. So with, especially anytime you start using fractals, with these shapes, the quality boost needs to be turned up on the terrain in order for it to render a nice smooth edge. What you can also do for the atmosphere is decrease the scattering number, which will create kind of an overall glow throughout the scene, and that will help with the ambient light. So I'm just going to re-render this with those new settings. Also, I'm going to go and change that horrible color. That just does not look right. Desaturate it. And also take the contrast and turn it up just a little bit. Except on that layer where I'm going to mix that. And I did just modify a few things because the render was going to take too long. I turned down the quality boost to 2 instead of 4 and deleted the secondary material and turned down the frame size because it was going to take more than an hour to render that other one. Partially because of the material blend, but mainly because of all of the extra geometry needed to be created for the quality boost. So this is definitely a type of terrain that would be really gain a benefit from the baking technique, rendering the noise out first, saving that, and then extruding with an image, because otherwise you're going to be stuck rendering for hours in order to get something that looks good. But I'm pretty happy with the levels on this. Has a lot of nice depth to it. So I'm going to go ahead and save out the alternate version of this. And the last thing I want to show you involves the mapping types. basically having to do with the input of position. So what I'm going to do, and actually I think because this has gotten a little difficult to see within this view, if I zoom in, that's going to be alright. Maybe I was thinking about possibly deleting that modifier, but I think I will leave it in. Depending on how it interferes with this next thing I want to show you. So what I'm going to do is add in an input node position options. We're going to change this over to object cylindrical and connect the function to the cylinder. Now because of the way the vector is and that manipulator, these should also be connected. Obviously we were seeing a lot of stretching. So what we need to do is manipulate the y vector, pretty much all of these, and I think once again I'm going to need to create some sort of unified connector. So I'm going to add in math node vector operation offset, connect all of these to that offset, and then add in one more math node, which is going to be the XYZ product. And take the Y, and let's decrease to 0.2. And then we can increase the X to say 3. That works a little bit better for this function. It is going to, over time, stretch and stretch more and more. But you can see it gives a really cool circular effect, which gets added to everything. So if we were to take a look at this, and I'm also going to just increase the scale of the terrain so that we can see the features a little bit better. And it looks like maybe I increased the X too much, because we're not really seeing the right kind of sections. So I'm going to go back to the XYZ product, set the X to 1, and maybe take the Y, modify it, bring it back a little bit to 0.5. So let's just cut it in half for now. Really depending on the function you're using, this will give a different output. The reason we're seeing these large vertical strips everywhere is because of that multiplier. But it still gives you an idea of the kind of stuff you can do with changing that input. So now it is a circular effect. I also want to note this requires at least 4 for the quality boost, because if you take a look even in the OpenGL preview, I had mentioned earlier in the training about the way the triangles are and having the points be in the wrong places. And what's happening is with the polygon it's being stretched. We'll go ahead and switch this to the wireframe mode. So what we can see is the blocks and the way the polygons are set up. Instead of the division where it is split being the edge, it is right in the center. So we have these huge, just jagged edges. That is unavoidable whenever you want any sort of angular shape outside of the grid. So if you turn up the quality boost, it increases the geometry and it takes care of those jagged edges. because we can see it's going to look terrible if I render it right now. It's going to look just about the same as the OpenGL preview. We've got the quality boost set to 2 right now. We might be able to get away with that. I'm going to go ahead and just render this. Okay, so this one is definitely a boost of 4 is going to be needed. Anytime you have those angles, it's just required in order to get a good terrain. Also, the height plays a big role in that. If you reduce the overall height of the terrain, that will help. Remove some of that and just make a higher contrast of everything. And that is just way better. You can see there's still a few jagged areas showing. Those are caused by the fact that I'm using the final render mode and also because of the size of the render output. So if rendering broadcast is taking too long to render, I would suggest rendering a final preset mode instead of switching over, because actually I think in this case, as of version 8, possibly even 7, the advanced effects quality in the preset was reduced to be equal between these two. It looks like it maybe just turns on basically an animation quality version of the final mode, having texture anti-aliasing and also the motion blur. So until you hit superior, you don't have an advanced effects quality that is different. So you can switch over to the user settings, increase the advanced effects quality manually, and also render out a little bit larger and scale it down afterwards. You'll find that a lot of times in Vue, when you're rendering, it's really quicker to render in a lower quality preset mode, or just if you set it up manually, rendering at lower quality but much larger, and it looks better. Then you can scale it down if needed. That's also a great way to get rid of flickering. Render twice as large as you need, and then you can scale it down in post. For stills, you've got a little more flexibility because you don't have to be locked into a long amount of frames that need to be rendered. Now, that center portion is really jagged. That's going to be the worst, and there's really not going to be a way to get around that within this fractal itself, just because of the way that's set up. But one thing we can do is remove that area. And in order to do that, what we can do, probably the simplest way, and this function is getting rather large and hard to move around in, so it should be meta nodes, but that's alright. What I'm going to do is select this link, this last portion here, add in a blender, add in a constant node, set to constant number, -1. Depending on what our output is. Our output is, that looks like that should be around the bottom point. We could also level it out to the center. But we're going to connect that to the -1 and then also add in a noise and get that to be connected to the original position input. That way it's not modified by that cylinder. And set this to a math pattern. And we can use a tooth rectangular, which is going to be a very sharp cutoff. Clip the ratio 0 to 1, and then we can adjust the size. So we'll just cut it out. This is another way too, so instead of multiplying, because we could also offset this tooth up and then multiply it, especially if we're going to have some sort of gradient, because we can also change this over to the Gaussian mode so that the fall off is more of a divot. If you want to have that sort of an effect, we can see it's more like a crater. And then you could adjust the contrast. There's the triangular mode, which is a sharper cutoff, rectangle. If you're already going to have a quality boost that is high enough to render this, then you'll be able to render the sharp edge that will be created from this. So that's probably the easiest way to remove that center section. And then you don't have to worry about all those jagged areas. Another thing that's kind of cool is you can turn on the zero edges. And that creates a nice overall kind of dome effect with the shape. And if you do want to adjust the height of that center portion, if you don't want it to subtract, you don't want it to go down, you want it to just level out, you can change that constant number up higher and just kind of pay attention to see how it's reacting with the rest of the function. So we could drop down lower, but that transition doesn't look great. So negative 0.5, maybe that'll work a little bit better. Or we could just use the Gaussian mode and set it to a higher value. So there's different ways we can deal with that. But this does look kind of cool because of the way it transitions and goes up, and allows you to create some pretty cool looking structures. And the diffused areas are a little jagged again, so I would need a higher render quality, or modifying the lighting settings could potentially get rid of that, or increasing the lighting quality. Because when I did switch over to a larger glow for the sky and overall lighting, it did smooth everything out. So that did definitely help. Another thing we can do, just continuing with this sort of circular effect, I thought was kind of neat. I'll go ahead and edit the function. What I want to show you is we can also mix this position options and use a blender to blend with another type of position input. So we'll add another position options input, and let's go ahead and just set it to object standard to start with. And now we can get a pretty cool design and shape out of that. It's kind of falling away from it. Looks pretty neat. If we go to the blender and set this to max, we can now create a section. We'll just have to get this to a portion where we can start to see it fall off. Let's go ahead and change that to object parametric. Okay, so now we have a halfway point. Half of it's that circle, the other half is the function. The original function, but much smaller. And then we could just set that amount and bring it down. And then it starts to kind of cut into it. So I did think that was kind of neat, manipulating the vector in that way. So that way we have one section that is the original function, and then it starts to cut away into that sort of circular shape. So here's the render of that. You can see it's a pretty interesting looking structure. I also want to note too, I mean, this is equally useful for creating materials. The function editor can be used throughout the program to create just about anything. Control a vast number of things in the program. You could even use this to control clouds, setting up ecosystems. So we're not just limited to the terrains for the function. Really just using it as a way to really show the geometry. Most of this stuff I would probably bake out, rendering out the noise as a material instead of using this geometry, and probably bring it into another program. But you can see that it's extremely powerful So there's so much you can do with it. So don't just feel restricted to creating terrains with it, even though you can do some really cool stuff with terrains. And there's one last manipulator for the vector, showing what we can do more with this rotation. And I do have a scene I created already that I kind of like, so I'm going to go ahead and load that in. So this is another manipulator that I had created where we've got this really interesting variation and kind of a spiral effect going on with that distortion of the cylinder input. And I just really liked the way that was formed. Thought it was kind of neat looking. If we take a look at the function and how I did this, I've got the connection to the position options cylinder, or the cylindrical, and then I'm using the projection onto a plane, which is a math node vector operation, to create that effect just by changing some of the settings. You can twist around or rotate basically the vector, and it modifies that spiral and stretches and manipulates the directions to create some pretty neat effects. So I thought that was kind of cool. Just something a little more out of the ordinary. Now, I think this node was introduced in version 8, so if you're using any previous version, you can use the math node vector operation rotation and twist to achieve the same effect. Just about the same. I'll go ahead and type in a couple of values. We should be able to get just about the same sort of look by modifying the rotation. So just about the same. Requires different settings, of course. And you may need to also twist it a little, which is actually more of a skew. It's not really a twist. So if you only have access to the rotation and twist, that is also available. You can see that creates a very similar effect. And if you're going to use that technique to kind of skew things around a bit, I suggest using a more minimalistic noise. So I would definitely avoid a fractal with it, because I think it's going to be distorted too much. I was able to get some nice flat separated zones using this one. I also subtracted the center with a multiply function with a tooth Gaussian, and I didn't use the blender with a constant node, which is why some of the areas in the center are spiky, because I didn't quite have the value high enough. But this one also looks really cool with that zero edge function turned on. You just get some really neat kind of structures you can create, and go beyond just the normal grid. So hopefully you learned a bit more about using the function editor in Vue and kind of applying it to the different areas and controlling different functions within the program.